I'd like to introduce you to Rob Piceathly from London Queen's Square. Rob's going to be talking to you about current treatment strategies.
Thanks, Alison, and thanks so much for the invitation to speak. It's great to be back here again. So, as Alison says, I'm Robert Piceathly. I'm an adult neurologist at UCL, where we run a clinic for people with mitochondrial disease, so it's an adult clinic. So some of the things I'll be talking about will be about the adult-related treatments, but many of this does also apply to children as well. I'm going to talk about what the treatment strategies are. So I'm going to talk about what the treatment strategies are for mitochondrial diseases. But I'm also going to touch a little bit about some of the trials that are ongoing at the moment and are currently recruiting in the UK, just to give you a flavour of that. So although the topic of my talk is current treatment strategies, it's actually a really exciting time at the moment for mitochondrial diseases in terms of trials worldwide. So people are developing new drugs for mitochondrial diseases, people are using stem cells for mitochondrial diseases, gene editing techniques for actually changing the DNA, both the mitochondrial DNA and the nuclear DNA. So it's a really exciting time to be involved in research in this area. And this was just taken from a recent review of all the different types of treatments and categories of treatments. And as you can see, both manipulating DNA, so changing the DNA, delivering the protein that's not working properly into the cell, so it can work properly, developing new treatments, drug treatments, and using stem cells. And actually, when you look at, there's a website that you can look at to look at all the trials across the world to see what's going on. This was in June. You can see there are 10 active trials at the sort of later stage of development, looking at treatments in patients with mitochondrial disease. So 5 years ago, this would have been a blank slide. So there's a huge amount that's changed over the last 5 years. But what about now? So what can we do at this point? And what is a treatment? So potentially anything that improves an individual's quality of life is a treatment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these drugs or vitamins that are used in mitochondrial disease. Some of these have been touched on already by previous speakers. I'm going to talk a little bit about exercise and diet, health surveillance and monitoring, which is actually, I think of all the things I'm going to talk about, the most important thing that we can do. I'm going to talk about emergency plans and acute management. Again, this has been touched on by previous speakers. And finally, just talk about a couple of the actively recruiting UK trials in mitochondrial diseases, just for information really. So these are all the treatments that we often get asked about in clinic. And you can see that most of them are vitamins, cofactors, and food supplements. And many of these were looked at in a very big study called a Cochrane study in 2012. And basically this just evaluates the evidence for whether these treatments are good treatments or not. And what the Cochrane study does, it looks at the design of the trial, and they have quite strict criteria as to the design of the trial. So it's really important when you're doing a study of a treatment that the study is well designed, that there's no bias introduced into it, because both, we all want the treatments to work, so you can't help introducing this natural bias. And so the gold standard study, when you're looking at these treatments, is called a randomized controlled trial, and it's double blind, so it involves a drug and it involves a placebo, which is a sort of sham. And everyone's given half the people are given one, half the people are given the other, but neither the doctor nor the individual having the treatment know which one they're taking, and that tries to avoid that bias that's introduced into a trial. And so this study looked at all of those trials. There were over 1,300 studies of some form looking at treatments in mitochondrial disease. Only 12 of those were well designed and fulfilled these criteria. The best gold standard trial is a randomized controlled trial that was double blind. And these are some of the vitamins listed here are some of the vitamins that were looked at in these trials. And again, a lot of you will be familiar with some of these vitamins and supplements. And unfortunately, there was no evidence that any of these really improved the mitochondrial disease. And this is just a table taken from that study listing, and I don't expect you to read the text on this, but this just summarizes the studies themselves. And what you can see really is actually the number of people recruited to these, even though they're really well designed trials, the number of people was quite low. And that is important, because if this was a blood pressure tablet or a diabetes tablet, that number would be in hundreds to thousands of individuals. But obviously in mitochondrial disease, because it's such a rare disease, the numbers are much lower. And the problem with that is, even if you have a really good treatment, potentially you might miss an effect because you just haven't looked at enough people to power the statistics to show that effect. So it might have been some of these tablets and vitamins are actually good treatments for mitochondrial disease, but just not enough people were recruited into the study to prove that. But that's something that when you're designing your trial, you need to really think about and be quite clever about the way you design it to ensure that you're, if there is an effect, that you're going to see it. And that's something we need to consider as a community of doctors and researchers in mitochondrial disease when we're designing trials, and also to make sure that we're all working together to make sure these studies are going across the world, really, to make sure there are enough people in them to see these effects. So these were the studies with numbers above 30, and you can see that was coenzyme Q10 and dichloroacetate. The other thing to look at here, apart from the numbers, is the kind of conditions that were looked at. And in the ideal study, you have a single group of people, all with the same problem in terms of the way it's affecting them, and all caused by the same genetic change. So a really homogeneous group of people. And as you can see here, this was quite a mixed group of people with mitochondrial disease. So they didn't all have the same clinical problems. And the reason that can make things difficult is when you're using measures to work out whether something's working or not, you want it to be as consistent as possible across the group of people that you're looking at to work out whether it's helping. For instance, how far they're walking, or what their muscle strength is. So if you have a very mixed group of people, it's more difficult to compare those measures because each person has a different problem. But again, that's a challenge for mitochondrial diseases, because as you know, and as you've heard, how varied they are. And again, as a community of researchers, we need to think of the best outcomes for these trials. So many of the treatments I've mentioned so far are based around this thing called reactive oxygen species, because ultimately, no matter what the problem is with your mitochondria, it affects how well you produce energy. And a byproduct, which is completely normal for this series of reactions that's happening in the mitochondria that produces energy, is this thing called reactive oxygen species. And that's going on all the time. Some people think that contributes to aging, the whole aging process. But if you've got a problem with this group of enzymes that are producing these reactive oxygen species, you get more of them, and that can actually potentially damage the mitochondria itself. So it makes sense that if we can reduce these toxic reactive oxygen species, then maybe it will help with an individual's mitochondrial disease. And so there are a whole host of different vitamins that are aimed at doing that, reducing these bad oxygen species. So lipoic acid, vitamin C, vitamin E, a whole host, but the one that we use routinely is called coenzyme Q10. And that acts in two ways. That tries to reduce the number of these reactive oxygen species by just improving the efficiency of these enzymes that are producing energy, and by improving how well the electrons which are running between these enzymes are being shuttled between them. So it's sort of acting in two ways. And so what we will do in our clinic is we will, if someone's got mitochondrial disease, we'll give them a trial of this coenzyme Q10. We'll give 3 to 6 months worth. At the beginning of the trial, we'll give a questionnaire about fatigue, because that's really what this vitamin helps best with, muscle symptoms, particularly fatigue. And then we'll do the questionnaire at the end of the 6-month period and see if they've got any better. And if they got better, then we'll continue it. If not, then we tend to stop it, only because there's no point being on something that's not helping. So that really is the only treatment that we routinely prescribe in our clinic. We don't routinely prescribe anything else.
Oh, sorry. Is there any, if they're on it for any longer than that, is there a problem with that?
No, absolutely not. It's because it's a naturally occurring vitamin. It doesn't tend to have many side effects. Sometimes people can get some.
He's been on it for a year. So
Yeah, no, you can be on it. No, it's a very, it's very well, it's really well tolerated. It's not people on it for forever. But I suppose what I'm saying is, if you're on it, if we start it and it doesn't seem to help with anything, then we just, in adults, we don't tend to continue after that 6-month period.
Thank you.
So what we tend to do, how much of the Q10? Yeah, so the question is how much of the Q10 can you have a day? So what we do is, because this is something you can buy in vitamin shops and online and things, so we like to prescribe it ourselves because we know that the source that we're getting it from is a good one and that it's likely to contain what it should contain. And so we'll start 1 tablet twice a day, so that's 100 milligrams twice a day, and then we'll increase that to a maximum of 300 milligrams twice a day. So the total dose is 600 milligrams, and we don't go above that. And if at that level, after a few months, there's no improvement in the fatigue, then we tend to stop it. Okay, so so the other thing I just wanted to point out before moving on from the vitamins is, so what I'm talking about really is for any type of mitochondrial disease. When we give this, we can give coenzyme Q10. But it is important to remember there are a number of conditions, that sort of metabolic or mitochondrial conditions, where actually the genetic problem is affecting that vitamin specifically, either the way it gets across the gut, or the way it's transported into the cell, or the way it's utilised. And actually in that situation, giving it can have a far greater effect. So although when we give coenzyme Q10, it can help a bit with some people, it helps none with others, it can help more in others. There are certain conditions where if there's a deficiency specifically in that vitamin, actually replacing it can have a much greater effect. And so it's important to consider that when you're seeing someone for the first time, whether they might have a genetic problem that's specifically affecting a particular vitamin. And there are genetic mitochondrial problems that, for instance, do affect coenzyme Q10 specifically in the way it's produced. And actually giving it in that scenario you can see a much greater effect. And there are a number of other examples, for instance, with riboflavin and thiamine, where you can see a greater effect than you might expect with other types of mitochondrial disease. And finally, there are two particular mitochondrial diseases that actually just get better on their own, just with supportive treatment. Again, this is more something that I think clinicians and doctors need to be aware of, so that when you're treating someone, that you know that if you support them, it might take 6 months, it might take 12 months, but actually they might just get better on their own without any specific treatment. And so again, it's important to be aware of these conditions, just so you understand the possible natural history of the condition, because that might affect your decision making when looking after children and adults with these serious conditions which get better on their own. So that's all I was going to say about the vitamins and those cofactors. So as I say, the only one that we routinely use is that coenzyme Q10. So moving on to exercise. So exercise is just a good thing to do for all of us. Obviously keeps you generally fit, helps your heart, and actually, particularly in muscle diseases, if you're unfit and on top of that you have a problem with your muscles, not just mitochondrial disease, but lots of other muscles can as well, that can have a sort of an even bigger effect and make the muscles even worse. So we generally give advice to all people with mitochondrial disease and other muscle diseases. Exercise is a good thing. In mitochondrial disease, as well as it just being generally a good thing, there is some evidence that actually exercising helps with the ratio of the bad and good mitochondria, and potentially exercise might increase the number of good mitochondria in your muscles. So in addition to being fitter and your muscles being stronger, potentially there might be a shift. It's important to remember that's not been proven in one of these gold standard trials, and that's something that's being looked at. But there is a sort of evidence to say that there's an additional benefit in mitochondrial disease, even over other muscle diseases, that exercise is a good thing. And so we talk about exercise a lot in clinic. We have a physiotherapist who helps prescribe exercise. It's very much tailored for that individual because it's individual specific. Some people can do more than others, and so it's making sure that the exercise is done within that person's abilities. And so she'll go through things in detail with that person, and she'll help them come up with a kind of exercise regime that they can follow to get themselves as fit as possible and help with the muscle strength and the fatigue.
When you say increase good mitochondria, do you mean that they grow more or that the other ones heal?
That's a really good question. So hopefully both. But I think what the evidence is that the mitochondria that are there, if you had 100 mitochondria, maybe you get 150 mitochondria in that cell. So that there are more mitochondria. So the exercise stimulates the number of mitochondria. The hope is also, obviously, by doing that, the mitochondria that are going up are the good mitochondria, and they're diluting the bad mitochondria. Now, whether the bad mitochondria go down as well, that's probably, there's less evidence for that. I think that is a good question, because obviously what you wouldn't want to do is exercise and increase, if you increase both sets of mitochondria, essentially the ratio is between them is the same, so you're not really having an effect. And certainly what you wouldn't want to do is shift it towards the bad mitochondria. But the evidence is actually all the mitochondria go up, and actually the ratio between good and bad goes in the right direction.
Sorry, can I just ask, is there any clinical evidence of that at all anywhere written?
Yeah, there was preclinical evidence, but not in one of these big trials. So not in one of these randomized trials where you can see a difference with no bias introduced, and that's what
So
we're
you can't
looking at.
use in an EHCP to get more physio or OT and
No, I don't think you'd be able to. No, unfortunately no. But I mean, if we can get the robust evidence, then that's when we're going to use it, and that's why it's so important, I think, to get this evidence. That's a good question. Thank you. So then moving on to diet. So again, there's some evidence of sort of diet, changing your diet can help with your mitochondria, particularly this thing which some of you may have heard of called the ketogenic diet, which is a very high fat, it's like an Atkins diet, high fat, low carbohydrate diet. And really it's the thought behind it is you're getting energy via different sources. Again, unfortunately, no randomized controlled trials looking at that. And there are, you have to be very careful with changing diet in mitochondrial diseases. It should be done with the oversight of a specialist dietitian who prescribes that, because again, as many of you are aware, people with mitochondrial disease often find it quite difficult to put on weight, and these diets often make you lose weight, and that's sometimes the last thing we want to do. There are certain conditions specifically that this is used for, a condition called PDH deficiency. Sometimes it's used for seizure control as well. Again, all of this has to be done by experts. So moving on to the health surveillance, I've got my 5-minute warning, so I'll speed up slightly. The theme, I think, of the day is that you get this clinical variability in mitochondrial disease, and so this makes it challenging in terms of diagnosis. It also means people end up seeing often lots of different specialists, because depending on what your problem is, you can present to a different type of doctor. But that's why it's so important that when you do get a diagnosis, all of these things are overseen by someone who's looking for them. Because it is quite easy, actually, as a specialist in different areas, to focus on your specialty and to maybe overlook some of these other things that are going on. So a lot of what we're doing in clinic is actually, we're just providing oversight. We're making sure that the heart's being looked after and the lungs are being looked after. As a neurologist, I do prescribe anti-epilepsy drugs and things, but I might get someone from the endocrine team to look at the gland problem. So it's just really important to really have a very holistic approach to people with mitochondria because of all the sorts of problems they might get. And there are lots of things that, if you're looking out for these problems, there are lots of things you can do about them. So actually, really close surveillance allows early treatment. And as you can see on here, there are all sorts of things that we can do for many of these problems. I'll very briefly mention this because it's already, I think it was Professor Poulton mentioned this already. So we've got a fantastic website supported by Lilly for both patients and professionals that has a huge amount of information. And there is there is no excuse really, I don't think, for a doctor to say, well, I don't know anything about mitochondrial disease, you have to ask your specialist. Direct them towards this website. It's absolutely a fantastic resource. There are lots of guidelines that are there to refer to, and also all our contact details as well. So that's been fantastic. Emergency plans, again, this is very important across all the 3 centres that are delivering a national service to people with mitochondrial disease. We have emergency plans. I think it was Professor Paulson who mentioned, and in Oxford they have them as well. Very, very important, a really good summary that's individualised for that person, to make sure when they go and see a doctor, for instance, in hospital, they can give that to them, and it summarises all the problems, what they should be looking out for. And the other thing is, again, this has been touched on, but recognition of problems early is really important, because people with mitochondrial disease get sick very quickly, and so it's important to recognise that, and the sorts of symptoms that can herald, someone becoming really unwell, and to seek help quickly. And whether that's the GP or having a low threshold for going to the emergency department, that's really important. Because often if you get these things early, they're treatable. If you leave them too long, it becomes much more challenging. And it's things like infections, making sure that if someone's got an infection, it's making their mitochondrial disease worse. It's treated early. If someone's dehydrated, they're getting adequate hydration, whether it's that might be in the form of a saline, a drip. Make sure that if any medication changes, that's not what's caused all of it. And if, as I say, if a hospital admission is needed, that needs to be thought about earlier rather than later. So I don't know whether I've got maybe 2 minutes. Have I got, is that okay? Yeah. So I just thought I'd finish, so that's really all I wanted to say about the current treatments. And you can see, apart from the coenzyme Q10, a lot of this is about supporting, being aware of early signs of being sick, close surveillance of all the complications, of which we can do a lot. But I want to emphasise, as we did at the beginning, this is a very exciting time for people with mitochondrial disease in terms of treatments. So both people with mitochondrial disease and researchers developing these treatments. And although a lot of these treatments are still some way off, we've come a huge distance in the last few years with these. So I just wanted to touch on 2 trials that are actively recruiting. As you see that slide at the beginning, there are 10 trials worldwide, but these are 2 trials that are being undertaken in the UK right as we speak. So the first is, and you've heard a bit about Nicotinamide Riboside. So this is a type of vitamin, and it's a vitamin that is a bit like exercise. It increases the number of mitochondria, but rather than it being via exercise, it's via this vitamin. And the hope is that if you increase your number of, if you have not enough mitochondria, or not enough good number of healthy mitochondria, you've not got enough energy, and if you can increase the number of healthy mitochondria, you get more energy above that sort of level, because we think often there's a level or a threshold when you've got certain types of mitochondrial disease where you fall down below the threshold, and that's when you get symptoms, because the energy's gone below a certain level. And if we can push above that level, then maybe we can reverse some of those symptoms. And so that's the aim of the treatment. And there is an experimental medicine study at the moment that's ongoing, looking at a small number of people with a certain type of mitochondrial disease that particularly affects the muscles. This is in adults. And so far, there are 2 stages to this trial. The first is looking at the vitamin itself. So when you take the vitamin, what goes on in the blood? Does the vitamin get into the blood? How well does it get into the blood? And then the second stage is to see whether it does what it should be doing. Because when they looked at animals with this vitamin, it seemed to work really well. So it did show signs of the animals improving. So they looked at an animal with a type of mitochondrial disease versus a normal a mouse with a type of mitochondrial disease versus a normal mouse, and they showed that actually the mouse with the mitochondrial disease improved to the same level as the other mouse, so it could run as fast on a treadmill. And so they're looking at a similar sort of thing. Does it do what it should be doing? Do the mitochondria go up? Do the health of the mitochondria go up? And as Alison alluded to at the beginning, we're involved with trying to improve this vitamin, because although you can buy this vitamin on the internet, when we looked at it in the lab, it looked like actually when you take the vitamin, not much gets into the blood. And so yes, it looks great when you look at it in a dish, but you've got to think about it in real terms. So if you were to take this vitamin, if nothing else, if the vitamin's not getting to the mitochondria and not having that effect that you see in the dish, then it's pointless. So what we're trying to do is trying to improve how well that vitamin gets into the blood and then potentially into the mitochondria to see if we can make it even better than it is. So the study that's ongoing is using the standard form of the vitamin, and we hope that works. But we're hoping to also, in parallel to that, improve on the existing standard form to make it even better. Because again, it comes back to when you're doing these trials, it's really important to maximise the chances of seeing an effect. Because you spend a lot of time and money, and it's not just time of the, it's obviously your time being involved in a study, and obviously researcher's time. You want it to work, so you want to maximise your chances of it working. This is what we're trying to do. So we do a bigger trial of the vitamin. We want to really maximise our chances of it showing an effect, so we can then actually get it approved and actually be able to prescribe it. So it's a real shame to miss an effect, because then often those treatments are not revisited. They're just discarded, even though they might be useful treatments. And then the second study I just want to mention, again, some of you may be aware of this, is a treatment with this drug called enamipritide or bendavir, which is produced by a company in the States called Stealth Biotherapeutics. And this is to be honest, this is a drug that's injected into the skin, and there's compelling evidence that it helps, irrespective of what type of mitochondrial disease you have, in terms of how far you can walk. That was mainly what they looked at. And the drug, they're not really sure how it works. They think it binds to the enzymes that produce energy and bring them closer together. And so they become more efficient at producing energy, because the closer they are, the easier they work together. And it comes again back a little bit to these bad oxygen species. If you produce more oxygen species, the enzymes get a bit further apart and they become less efficient. They produce more oxygen species, they get further apart, and so it's a vicious cycle. And so what this is doing is it's like glue. This drug is gluing the enzymes together to make them more efficient. And there's some, as I say, there's some compelling evidence for this. And so there's a study at the moment that we've been involved with, which is a worldwide study. This is quite a late phase trial. So this is a trial that would be just before it being licensed as a drug. Because many of the trials in mitochondrial disease are very early phase trials looking at safety. This is actually one of the really late phase trials. And they're looking at it in anyone with mitochondrial disease, irrespective, again it's adults, anyone with mitochondrial disease, irrespective of what sort of mitochondrial disease they have. They're looking mainly at, again, this walking test, that you walk for 6 minutes and you see how far you go. And the hope is that if you take this drug, after a certain length of time, you'll be able to walk further in that 6 minutes. So I've had my wrap up, please. Warning. So this is so that we've started this, and London and Newcastle are involved in this study, which will hopefully be starting in the next few months. So lots of exciting treatments in the pipeline, but there's lots we can do now. No clear evidence from trials for current treatments. And so it's really important that we focus on very close surveillance to make sure we don't miss complications of the disease so we can treat it early. Thank you very much.